All right. Well, without further ado, we're going to move on to our second presenter of the evening. And we have Chip Horgan with us tonight, and he is the CEO of Medical Ingenuities. Chip, thank you so much for being here.
I want to first thank AngelMD for having us and everyone who's participating tonight. Medical Ingenuities was developed by me, Chip Corrigan, as the founder and the CEO. We've been focused on the interventional radiology market, and more in particular, which is very interesting following Daniel, we're the radial closure after a procedure, a cardiac catheterization done in the cardiac cath lab after a stent or an angioplasty is done. And it's to get patent hemostasis at the end of a cardiac catheterization. And more importantly, the key there is patent hemostasis, to stop the bleeding, allow the healing to take place, but not to compromise the vessels below because you're applying pressure. And we'll describe that a little bit more. But the biggest problem that we see in the cardiac cath lab with radial access is that the current bands at the end of the procedure do not achieve patent hemostasis. They achieve hemostasis, which means they stop the bleeding, but this results in numerous complications. Radial artery occlusion rates between 8 to 12%, hematomas between 3 to 6%, rebleeding events between 3 to 6% also. And this creates greater than a $1 billion economic burden to the healthcare system. But more importantly, the burden that takes place within the nursing staff. They have to adjust these bands every 15 to 20 minutes to try and get patent hemostasis and prevent those complications, as well as that leads to longer times in the recovery room and possibly staying the night at the hospital, which is not a financial benefit to the hospital itself. And this is all caused by the existing radial compression bands not being able to get patent hemostasis. And Dr. Kerrigan quoted as best saying, "This is our biggest problem with radial closure. We are just guessing that we are achieving patent hemostasis." And the key with this is that what we did at Medical Ingenuities, we developed the patent hemostasis band to simplify patent hemostasis by removing the guesswork with real-time feedback, by providing a microdoppler probe incorporated into the pH band. And if you look in the first picture here, you can see the pH band on a patient's arm. You can see the little square microdoppler probe, as well as the sheath. What we actually do is we inject 15 cc's of air in the second picture. This actually is more of a tourniquet type of thing at this point, which we completely occlude the vessel below. We then pull the sheath out, and you can see we still have occlusion, but at this point you have hemostasis, just like all the other bands. In slide 4, which really differentiates us from the others, we start releasing air slowly until the vessel opens up. Once the vessel opens up, you're getting a ping, a sound wave sent down through that microdoppler. Once it hits the blood cells, it actually rebounds back and will give an audible signal to the physician, allowing them to know that they've achieved patent hemostasis and they stop releasing some of the air. So the science behind patent hemostasis is you need blood flow for the healing to take place. As you can see, you need the platelets and other factors to get to the injured area and begin the healing process. SCI, the Society of Cardiovascular Angiography and Intervention, who puts best practice techniques out or recommendations out there, says you need to achieve patent hemostasis after a radial procedure. And the reason that they say this is that in all the clinical studies, we know that if you can achieve patent hemostasis, you can reduce complications by well over 90%. We also know that 50 to 80% of the patients are released from the hospital without any real confirmation of patent hemostasis. The gold standard in cardiology, as well as a lot of the hospital, has been a Doppler. With the patent hemostasis band, we're using a simple Doppler through sound, which will indicate the direction of the blood flow to make sure that we have patent hemostasis. There's a more complex Doppler out there that will give you sound and a visual picture, which will indicate direction, blood flow, and a few other things that we'll look at a later date to get into those. But the key is we know that if you use Doppler to follow up on patients before they're released from the hospital, you will see a 2 to 4 times higher rate of radial artery occlusion rates. And the reason for this is the current techniques do not and are not as accurate as they should be, which is why we're seeing a radial artery occlusion rate around 8% worldwide. So a little data comparison, because we did receive FDA approval, and we just started doing cases, but we did a small feasibility study here a year ago. And what we actually saw in that is we were able to achieve patent hemostasis. We got the antegrade flow we wanted. We had 0 complications and reduced the compression time down to 1 hour. Now, in a meta-analysis of all the studies of 66 studies over 30,000 patients, you'll see that they did not get patent hemostasis or antegrade flow, but the nurse had to adjust the band every 15 to 20 minutes, causing a lot of extra workload in the nurse. And the radial artery occlusion rate in all those studies is between 1 and 33%, which is quite high. They didn't look at rebleeding and hematomas, and the average time to hemostasis was 2 to 6 hours. And the two most recent studies with the gold standard in the industry, the TR band, you can see that once again, did not achieve patent hemostasis, no documentation on flow, but the complications are the interesting point. Their focus was to reduce radial artery occlusion rates, which they were able to do to get that down to about 0 and 1%. But they even state that they had to do meticulous use of Doppler and drug cocktails, and that the average person would not be able to do it. But they do multiple adjustments between 4 and 7%. They also had rebleeding events between 5 and 67%, hematomas at 18 and 7%. And their time to hemostasis was 1 hour to 3 hours. So our timeline is we started in 2017 where we finalized the development of the pH band. We did the human feasibility study we just talked about, had our 2 patents, raised a little bit of money, moved on to 2020 where we at the end got FDA approval. Another small seed round. We started building up the manufacturing operations during the last couple of years. We've built a sales pipeline of over 14 million potential sales tied up in value analysis committees at various hospitals across the country. We also raised another 515,000. This year, we've started developing a comparative study of over 1,800 patients, which will be a revenue-generating study within Ascension. We're currently in the market. We just did our first 2 cases, or four cases yesterday, 4 perfect cases. We'll submit for a pedal indication as well as some more filings. We're in the middle of a $1 million raise, which we've raised 565,000, and looking for an exit sometime in 2024. We have a very strong team with over 100 years of medical device development and sales and marketing experience, bringing products to market, and an extremely strong advisory board, really of radialists across the country that are who's who, well published, trained in this, a lot of podium presence, as well as a key nurse that sits on the SCI guidelines as well as works with the AIM radio board. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and open it up to any questions.
Great. Thank you, Chip. Thanks for being here. And we really appreciate your presentation tonight. I'm going to begin by letting Dr. Coley again say a few words and start with a few questions.
Okay.
Somebody had to do that. So
yep.
I said, thank you so much for that presentation. And in the era of radial first, which we're in very much right now, I think it is really important to reduce vascular complications when it comes to the radial artery. So I commend you for designing this. I did have a couple of specific questions. The first was, tell me about the intellectual product here, because clinically, we're not seeing nearly that many complications happening with our TR band and most of the occlusion devices that we have now. Now, there are some complications that happen as a result of lack of collateral flow, which I think this device would circumvent. But what would you be designing as the intellectual product here? Because it seems like an upgrade to the pre-existing closure device that we have, but not necessarily a new concept in and of itself.
Right. It is an upgrade. And there's actually right now we've got 2 patents, which really it's a dual band in order for a single operator to use this device to be able to remove the sheath and get patent hemostasis. The key is that a lot of these complications get lost in the mix because a patient 2 to 3 days later has hand numbness, pain. They don't go back to the cardiologist. They go back to the primary care or the vascular surgeon. And actually, there was just a recent study on that where the vascular surgeons are seeing a 6.6% radial complication rate with hand pain. So it kind of gets lost in that scenario. But we do have quite a bit of intellectually around it in the fact of you have to have a dual band in order for one-person operation, as well as the band has a split in it so that it lines up perfectly, so that it makes it very simple for an individual to use it. And the way that you've got the Doppler, the sheath, as well as the pressure all lined up for perfect access. So that's where all the patents revolve around it to be able to keep others out of this little space. And I guess it's really not that little if you look at the size of the market anymore. It's actually very large.
And my other question would be that the first in human studies that you did were presumably on healthy volunteers, but how does this band perform in those on anticoagulants or those who might be on antiplatelet agents or, right after a large dose of heparin is administered? will it still achieve adequate hemostasis?
So we actually just did 4 patients on Monday, which is our first commercial patients. So they were all, one was an intervention, the other 3 were diagnostics. So that's right in line with you want. Our numbers were exactly the same. 1 hour compression time. We had, perfect hemostasis at closure and at the release of the patient. We actually do follow the patient for that hour. Once they take the band off, we check again to make sure that we have patent hemostasis. So it works fine. It worked fine in all those 18 patients that we did at Rex Healthcare in our feasibility study also. So the anticoagulation wasn't a problem. And I know there were patients on, various anticoagulants without any issues at this point.
Great. We're going to take a few questions from our audience as well. One from one of our other cardiology clinical advisory board members. Does the Doppler probe integrate with current workflow? Is there RN training that has to occur for monitoring this, or is it the physician that becomes responsible for monitoring the Doppler? So talk a little bit more about the workflow.
Well, the key is there's not much real workflow in the fact that it takes a minute to a minute and a half to put the device on, in which the Doppler is applied underneath the band. So once you get patent hemostasis, you don't have to monitor the patient. And that's what we saw at Rex in the 4 patients yesterday, where we actually took the band off or took the Doppler off. And then we followed up just for the heck of following up at a year, just to prove that the patent hemostasis maintained through the recovery period. So there's really no real training. Most people in the cath lab know how to use a Doppler system. It's an audible Doppler, pocket Doppler. So it's not very hard. And that was one of the things going back to the patent. It's perfectly lined up so that when you put it in the Doppler underneath the band, it actually lines up right behind the sheath, which means you're sitting right on top of the artery. So you automatically pick up the signal.
Great. And one more question for you, and this is a little bit goes to your competition. With more and more distal radial being used, how much market share will this device have, do you believe?
Well, the key is that you want to get patent hemostasis. We have the ability to actually make this a gold standard, that you need to get patent hemostasis. And the only way to get that is through a Doppler, because that vessel actually branches off into 2 vessels right below the thumb. So you've got a very small area to actually get that patent hemostasis signal. So we have an opportunity to capture a large percentage of this market.
Great. Chip, thank you so much again for being here tonight. I know we have additional questions in our Q&A. And again, I would encourage all of you to continue the conversation and networking after we finish with our 3rd presenter. But thank you to Chip and Medical Ingenuities for being here tonight.